Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming out to our group author reading. This reading is brought to you by Strong Women, Strange Worlds, which is a group of authors supporting authors. Our mission is to elevate the voices of women and other underrepresented gender identity authors of science fiction, fantasy, and horror, and related genres through events like these bi-monthly virtual quick read sessions. You can find out more about Strong Women, Strange Worlds at the link on our website, which has just been popped into the chat over there. So you will see that, and we'll probably also post it a couple more times throughout the event. I'm your host today. My name is Elaine Isaak. I also write as E.C. Ambrose, and you can find out more about me in the handout for today's event. That handout is going to be where you'll find the giveaways and links to the authors' websites and mailing lists to find out more about not only all of the readers that you'll be hearing from, but also the members of your cast and crew behind the scenes here at the Strong Women Readings. So today we are featuring 6 fabulous authors: Judith Huang, CJ Lavigne, Elin Olausson, Karen Heuler, Shameez, Patel, Papathanasiou, and Elizabeth Davis. Each author will have 8 minutes to read. Our first reader today is Judith Huang. Judith is a multimedia creator, author, and translator. Her first novel, Sophia and the Utopia Machine, which you'll be hearing from today, was shortlisted for the EBFP in 2017 and the Singapore Book Awards in 2019. Judith, take it away.
Thank you, Elaine. So I'm going to read from Sophia and the Utopia Machine today, and I'm going to read from the portion where Sophia is actually activating the Utopia Machine and creating a new universe in her mother's Biopolis lab in Singapore. And it's basically setting off the Big Bang. Okay, so here goes. Darkness and silence. Darker and quieter than anything on earth. Sophia's feet stood on nothing. Her hands held nothing, yet she did not fall, suspended somehow by herself. She couldn't see her body, yet she knew it was there. Sophia found she was holding her breath, that everything felt like it was holding its breath. Even though the darkness and silence were absolute and ancient, it all shivered with anticipation. It was waiting for something to happen. It was waiting for her. Somehow, she knew what she must do. Slowly, experimentally, she breathed out. Something glowed. It was her breath, or perhaps it came out of her breath. It was a thing where no thing had been before. It was a tiny thing at first, like the dim spook of a firefly glimpsed as a reflection on the water. But then it grew. It took her breath away. It escaped her as she tried to reach for it and skittered above something. It was reflected in something, though nothing had been there before. Then, suddenly, it burst. It displayed something huge, a plosive so large that sound was too slow to capture it. Sophia shut her eyes as the light washed over her. All at once, it rushed out in every direction, and she was sure of it. She heard the mad rush of music, a chorus that elaborated on the tune she had sung. And the universe, for that is what it was filled with things. She was not sure what to call them. Had she been a more sentimental type, she might have called them angels. But one thing was for sure, they were composed of matter. They bumped into her, a caterwauling bunch of things spinning and wheeling about in a state that could only be called joy. She felt them to be facets of herself, reflecting and bouncing off her, and at the same time, she felt them to be quite independent entities. Though they bumped into her, it was a pleasant sensation, and each bump seemed somehow to communicate a tune into her heart, so that when they all added up in the musical staff of her mind, it made a weird and wonderful polyphony that she was somehow unconsciously composing. The universe had not stopped growing. It was spewing things now like an exuberant baby, flinging sparks that flew out into the darkness and illuminated it. Never had Sophia been so afraid of stars. The crazy things were blooming and whirling all about her, and they were simultaneously huge and small to her, towering like giants and sparking like pinwheels as they whooshed outwards. The angels, it seemed, were drawing them this way and the other, seeming to squabble over where to place each one. Sophia found herself both impossibly small and implausibly large, depending on what she touched. She took one of the wheeling things gently and spun it on her finger. The angels gathered around to watch. It was a minuscule galaxy, and as Sophia flipped it around her fingers like a coin, it seemed to gain velocity and shine. I shall name this one mine, said Sophia, her soul overwhelmed by its beauty. And when she said those words, the galaxy seemed to be filled suddenly with orbs, like tiny jewels that sang with new songs. And when Sophia heard these, memories of the suns and planets and creatures and beings and molecules and atoms and quarks and shivers filled her to her fingertips. She remembered the way they were, and so they were. And every bond sang its own peculiar pitch, lacing in and upon itself, tunneling infinitely through and before and beyond her nostrils and straight through to her heart. And she smelled the most exquisite of perfumes. And amidst the drinking in of all the cacophony of the angels, Sophia stopped in shock and saw herself. She did not look like her nearly 15-year-old self, yet it was unmistakably her. She was seeing her above time, and so what she saw was a kind of creature whom she recognized as herself on a planet that looked exquisite and not unlike her Earth, but only it was dark amethyst and deep emerald. The woman who was her had limbs and a face that extended eternally time-wise, so she appeared both constantly moving and eternally still. Multiple versions of her seemed to merge into each other, stretching forward and backward in time, like the many folds of an accordion, and she was beautiful and powerful and terrifying to behold. And when this Sophia saw her watching her, she looked straight back in her eyes. A brief smile lifted the corners of her mouth, and her eyes lit up excitedly. Milton, she mouthed, though Sophia couldn't hear her, and it was as though she were talking to someone just over her shoulder, though Sophia could see no one there. In an instant, Sophia witnessed the forming of the crusts, the roiling of the gas clouds that parted to reveal the new Earth's fresh new face. The planet turned, rolling lazily on its back like a giant whale. Sophia loved it. She willed herself down into it. She wanted to walk its mountains, to walk its paths. She wanted to splash down on its oceans, to play with its creatures, to soar on its winds. Everything she saw, she illuminated with her gaze, and so for a space she closed her eyes and imagined herself falling softly, softly into the deep emerald of an old forest. Sophia stared. She didn't know how or why, but she knew who was standing before her. It was the form he took that was so surprising. Before her, tall and majestic, in the middle of the dark rainforest, was a magnificent orange and black Malayan tiger. They stood and looked at each other for a moment, neither moving a hair. Milton? She ventured shyly. The tiger stared back at her with fiery eyes and seemed to nod imperceptibly. Sophia, you have come. He didn't speak exactly. She was not sure if he emitted any sound. Yet Sophia heard the deep baritone in her mind and understood. You brought me here? The forest around her was thick with moisture, but cool from the dark green canopy. Unseen creatures scuttled in the underbrush. Again, the tiger lowered his head in acknowledgement. Its features seemed to soften. My Sophia, he said. The words were deep and tender. Sophia felt them in her bones, and somehow her fear gave way to wonder. She inched forward towards him before thinking it through and reached her hand out to touch his golden flank. He didn't feel like an avatar at all. This was flesh she touched, underneath the rough fur. She inhaled the scent of the deep, lush rainforest, and suddenly something overwhelmed her, like a wave engulfing the shore. She knew him. It wasn't a first meeting at all. It wasn't a second or a third or a fifth either. It was as though she had carried him within her somehow all her life. A strange bird called in the air. There are things you need to see, said Milton, his eyes flashing. Show me, said Sophia. That's it. Thank you. And I'm going to put the link to my work right there. And I'll be giving away a preview of the book. So do enter your email for this stuff. Thank you.
Wow, Judith, that was really beautiful and stirring. We got a lot of interesting conversation going there in the chat. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. We are going to be posting the link to that form that you can fill out in order to sign up and receive the giveaways in just a moment. But first, let me introduce our second reader, CJ Lavigne. CJ Lavigne is the author of urban fantasy novel In Veritas from New West Press 2020. Her short fiction has appeared in venues including Fusion Fragment, Augur Magazine, Daily Science Fiction, and Podcastle. She lives in Alberta, Canada. CJ, over to you.
Thanks. Okay, let's see here. The main thing you need to know in this book is that our protagonist, Verity, is wildly synesthetic. She sees sound, hears things she touches, everything gets all jumbled together for her. So she's always perceived a mysterious world that others don't. And in this scene, she meets a mysterious magician and discovers for the first time in her life that she may not be alone. The crowd thickens at the edges of the Byward Market, near vegetable stands and stalls filled with maple syrup, flowers, and beaded crafts. A magician is setting up near the corner of Sussex and George. He has a faded, collapsible table, a deck of cards, and a dog. The spot he's chosen is shaded by a stone archway between two restaurants. It's a curious choice for a busker, a dim recess on an already shadowed day. More, the magician and the dog are both in black. The magician with curling jet hair and a worn t-shirt, jacket and jeans and high boots like an urban pirate, and the dog just a sea of darkness lit by yellow eyes. The magician's hands are dusky and deft. The dog is the size of a wolf. The magician cocks his head to the left, and so does the dog. The magician fans a deck of cards in his right hand. The dog lifts its right front paw. To Verity, they both smell like sulfur and taste like 3 hours past midnight, so she stops. She stands just across the street, near the wall of a bookstore branded in red and gold, and frowns. At first, she thinks the magician is young, but he's too rangy for adolescent sleekness, and the mane of his hair thins slightly at each temple. He tastes so much like the dog that she half expects his eyes to flash gold, but when he and the dog glance over, in fluid accord, his gaze is dark. Both of their stares are feral, but the magician returns to his shuffling, and the dog watches a moment longer, one ear flicking low before Verity drops her eyes. When the card tricks start, the magician is neither terrible nor exceptional. He draws the queen of diamonds from a young boy's ear, but nearly fumbles the ace of spades. He conjures a rose from the air, from his sleeve, really, but he masks it well. The clouds are heavy enough to keep the market crowds light, but the show diverts a modest number of pedestrians. Children watch wide-eyed. Between the rolling crackle of passing cars and the sour-colored shift of stoplights, Verity makes out the easy rumble of pick a card and is this the right and magic word? The dog sits quietly and endures a small girl pulling on its tail. The cards only distract for so long before parents begin to tug at children's arms. The upturned ball cap by the folding table remains empty. The magician weaves and shuffles and smiles, narrow-eyed. When the first boy takes 2 steps toward the market, the magician cries, "But wait!" He reaches into the circle of his thumb and finger and pulls forth a gossamer black scarf. It has the look of living shadow, and Verity tilts her head. The scarf drifts lazily in the air as the magician spreads it between his hands. "My friends," the magician says, voice still pitched to Carrie, "are you afraid of snakes?" The dog paces to sit at its master's feet, plumed tail high. It is the exact midnight shade of the scarf and of the magician's leather jacket. Its untamed gaze rests on eager children and passing cars and Verity's pale hands. The magician lets the scarf fly like a banner from his upraised fingers and then drops it, letting it drift down to cover the dog like a shroud. The crowd, curious, now lingers. The boy reaches out for the dark cloth cover, hesitant. The magician waves a magnanimous hand. There's no magic word, no artistry to the trick, but the young boy reaches into the shadowed arch and pulls at the scarf's edge. The scarf slides from the sleek scales of the snake that now curls on the sidewalk where the dog used to be. The snake has the dog's black color and the dog's golden eyes, now pupilled by reptilian slits. It curls itself into a seething pretzel on the rough ground and flicks its tongue. A woman shrieks. They're not looking, the parents and the young children, even the magician, his eyes fixed on the boy, his teeth bared in a grin. They do not see Verity across the street, or the way her stare has focused, or the lumps her tight fists make in the pockets of her coat. Verity's world shifts, and only the snake sees. But the snake tastes like the smoke of fireworks and the deep stillness of night. The crowd gasps and oohs and ahs. The snake contorts slowly in mounded coils. Verity stands quietly. The magician's laugh is a sharp report. Thank you. You can sign up to win a signed hard copy of In Veritas, and I will ship worldwide. Thanks very much.
Wow, that was really beautiful. It was sucked right into your scene. I wanted it to keep going. But I guess that's why I have to sign up on your mailing list and buy the book, right? Good stuff. So thank you much for that fabulous reading. Our third reader today is Elin Olausson. Elin is a fan of the weird and the unsettling. She's the author of the short story collection Growth. Elin's rural childhood made her love and fear the woods, and she firmly believes that a cat is your best companion in life. She lives in Sweden. Elin, over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to read a short story from Growth. This story is called Rose and Caramel. Lucia came riding the dawn without here and there hair, and the carmine coat whispering forgotten poems around her fleshy thighs. Amelia leaned out of the doorway, breathing in the fading bus fumes and the rose and caramel scent that was Lucia. It had been too long, too many days without speaking, too many nights with loneliness and house groans keeping her awake. All that was gone now, the lonely nights carved away like wormholes in an apple. Lucia had come home. But you know I don't live here, she sat on the porch steps, with Amelia's stick figure arms squeezing her, with Amelia's weird little brain drowning in a sea of rose petals and caramel bonbons. Sweetie, I've got to go back to town now and then. I need my job. I know, Amelia sang, rose-drunk, face hidden in Lucia's hair. Please don't talk about your job, Luce, because I hate it. Yes. Lucia patted Amelia's shoulders. Shall we go inside? You haven't even let me put down my bags, you little monster. Amelia giggled as she darted inside to put the kettle on. She skipped through the kitchen, opening and closing cupboards, setting the table with Lucia's favorite cup and her own kitten-adorned one. The house filled with good sounds now. Sounds like Lucia taking off her boots, Lucia hanging her coat, Lucia heading upstairs with the bags. When she came back down, Amelia poured the lavender tea and waved at her to come sit down. How have you been? Lucia had calm, normal-colored eyes that Amelia had been jealous of at first because hers were strange and broken. But Lucia said they were pretty, and as long as Amelia didn't look too long into the mirror, she believed it. Good. Bored? Amelia fidgeted with the tablecloth. The questions. She didn't much like the questions. Lucia should know better than to ask them, because they made her love Amelia less. Bored. Lucia's eyes narrowed. Honey. It doesn't mean what you think it does. Except it did. The boredom was a sickness that ate at her, and it came crawling in through the window on lonely days. It was a tall, pale man with burning eyes and a smile that went all the way around his head. It was hungry and mean, and it played naughty games. It was only once, anyway. Lucia closed her eyes. Amelia quietly counted the wrinkles around them. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It's bad, Lucia said at last, and opened her eyes again. You know it is. But he doesn't. The man. Amelia hanged her head. Her hands were curled in her lap like withered, useless claws. I've told him, but he won't listen. Show me. Lucia stood, her tea untasted. Better just get it over with. Amelia held Lucia's hand and led her through the tall grass over to the shed. The sun peeking through the holes in the walls was so bright that no flashlight was needed to spot the bundle in the corner. She hadn't been to see him for a few days, and he had started to smell quite bad. Amelia. Lucia didn't vomit like she'd done the first few times. Who? He knocked on the door. He's not supposed to do that. She tried to remember more, but whatever the boy had said or done had gone lost in the maze that was her brain. She did recall that his eyes were an impossible shade of blue, a sea that was still or stormy depending on the light. Right, we have to bury him. Lucia tied her hair into a bun and grabbed the shovel and the wheelbarrow. The sounds she made as she was lifting the boy off the ground were just like the sounds he himself had made when Amelia killed him. Lucia pushed the wheelbarrow to the backyard, and Amelia came after with the shovel. Her thoughts were fluffy and light as clouds. I don't want to do this again. Lucia dug the hole away from the other ones, beneath the cherry tree. The boy slipped into the ground as if he felt at home there. Amelia enjoyed that thought. His face was pale as that of the man with a smile going around his head. But now that Lucia was here, Amelia knew that the wicked man didn't really exist. He was a nightmare that felt real, but wasn't. When the hole had been filled up again, it was a patch of bare soil in a sea of swaying grass. Amelia said that it looked as small as if they'd buried a baby, not a boy. But Lucia's wrinkles had multiplied, and she didn't smile. Back inside, she washed her hands and showered and wept loudly in the bathroom. And then she came out and finished her cold tea. You need to learn how to be lonely. Her hand fell on top of Amelia's, warm and just a little dry. You can't keep doing this. I won't do a thing now that you're here. Amelia tilted her head the way she had a lifetime ago, when her parents had been alive and could be persuaded to buy her sweets and curly-haired dollies. Not just then, Amy. You have to behave yourself when I'm off working, even when I'm gone for months. Months. Something clicked inside Amelia's curly-haired head. Months was the wrong word. It was twisted and foul. Lucia had never used it before, and she shouldn't start now. You're not on your own. Even when I'm not here, sweetheart, you're never on your own. Amelia saw his bony fingers land on the windowsill. A pale man, a man with burning eyes and a smile that went all the way around his head. Lucia kept talking, but his smile drowned out her words. His raspy voice danced through Amelia's mind, stopping here and there to inhale the scent of rose and caramel. Months. We can't have that. Months. We can't have. Thank you.
Wow, that was fantastic. Totally blew me away. Thank you so much for sharing that. There are a lot of interesting comments in the chat, so make sure that you go back there, Elin, and see what people have been saying and thinking while they were listening to your fantastic work. Our next reader is Karen Heuler. Karen's stories have appeared in over 120 literary and speculative fiction magazines and anthologies, including the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, and she has an upcoming story in Asimov. She's won multiple awards. The Splendid City is her 10th book. Karen, take it away.
The Splendid City, Chapter 1, Liberty. Betsy Bundaroo was used to seeing cats, but not ones who walked upright or spoke. She was standing at the bus stop reading the notice that said the bus had been canceled. Permanently. Why, she wondered, why don't they say? But these were the times, indefinite suspensions, removals, reversals, etc. Things suddenly were, and then just as suddenly were not. The structure is breaking down, she thought, and no surprise there. She felt a sort of grim satisfaction in it. So much had already changed since the election. Why not this too? Why should anyone work when none of it made sense? The president did not want buses to run anywhere near the palace, and that was necessary, she supposed. She understood. But the larger problem was that the world was going crazy. No one could tolerate anyone who didn't agree with them. It's true, the big black cat said, nodding wisely. Ah, she had been muttering again, a bad habit that was growing on her. The cat was wearing a bow tie and a fanny pack. I'm finding it very hard to have a reasonable conversation these days. Everyone shouts sound bites and no one shouts facts. I wonder if there are any facts left, she said with a sigh. I mean, everything is endlessly manipulated. If she'd had time, she would have wondered why she was having a conversation with a cat. But right then and there, she felt it was best to be polite because he was such a very large cat and he sounded irritated. Things would be so much better if there were no internet, the cat said moodily, because it spreads everything too fast. People see crap, believe it, and act on it before there's a chance to respond. And there's just never just one response. It branches out. Have you heard about those mushrooms whose underground roots spread out miles in all directions? That's the internet for you. But mushrooms aren't right or wrong, she said, frowning. I don't think you've quite got the right kind of analogy there. Really? He asked with a nasty, hissing kind of snarl, pulling off his fanny pack and rummaging through it quickly to pull out a gun. Really? He asked again and shot her. She clutched her upper arm. Blood ran through her clothes. The cat put the gun back in his pack and ran off. Eleanor was going to be mad. A happy growl rose in his throat. How was your day? Eleanor asked the cat when he walked in the door. She could see that he was miffed. He was always miffed. I shot someone again, he said, sighing. He had to agree it was becoming a nasty habit. I do regret it. You always regret it. It was very hard not pointing out the cat's failures. She tried to make sure her face was neutral. It wasn't easy. She had pale skin, medium-length brown hair, hazel eyes, and a face that gave away everything. Well, that just tells you about my character. I'm not actually the kind of person who goes around shooting people. And yet you do, she said. Let's consider the circumstances. No doubt they said something to annoy you. What was it? He frowned and shrugged his shoulders. She contradicted my theory about the internet being like a huge mushroom root. Stan, Eleanor said firmly, it's a bad analogy. Now do you want to shoot me? Stan scowled. I do. Of course he wanted to shoot her. Shooting people made him feel better for a while. And it was certainly true that she could benefit from being put in her place every so often. She was bossy, opinionated. He was the way he was because of her. Why not talk it out instead? You have the power of speech, so why not talk about things instead? Gloria will blame me if you continue to go around shooting people. I never kill them, you know, he said, his hairs rising. Try to be the kind of cat who never shoots them in the first place, she said. You're just drawing attention to yourself. The cat shrugged. Who'll believe a cat shooting a woman anyway? They're a nation of believers here, she said in disgust. Read a newspaper once in a while. Of course, his hands twitched at that, but he only allowed himself one shot a day. They were walking down the street when a bell rang out, a familiar sound in the city, though it rode from district to district around the palace. People stopped and turned, waiting to see the messenger approach. The message could be good or bad. Once a van had stopped a woman and then gave her the car that pulled up behind her. Then there was the time when a bunch of men got out of the van and grabbed a young man, a Latino by the looks of him, and pulled him inside. An older man ran towards the van, but he was too late. They were gone. The messengers were often on the news and were the most popular part of it after the reported disasters in the rest of the country and any attempts to overthrow the republic. Then the weather, updates about the president's latest triumph, and finally on to the messengers. People loved the giveaways and ignored the disappearances, which were generally explained as reunions. They were also fond of the whipped cream pies that hit people identified as tourists from the north. They'd better not hit me, Stan muttered. I've got a gun. Eleanor snorted. Everyone here has a gun. My gun is better, he said with satisfaction. Eleanor could see no point in challenging that. Besides, she often carried a can of whipped cream with her in case anyone threw a pie. She might not be able to prevent it, but she was all for revenge. Finally, Stan said, there have been fewer messengers this week. That's a relief. Maybe. I was hoping they'd stop for me and give me a car. You can't drive a car. Why not? She scowled. You're a cat. There were times when she thought that he just couldn't see himself as he was. But really, when had he ever? Which could change at any point, you know. All I have to do is hang in, and all you have to do is learn to be nice. He circled around himself in agitation for a moment. But that's the flaw in my plan, he growled. We're here because you were a jerk, Eleanor snapped. He always did it. He always had to bring things up and bring things up. And yet you're here too, he purred. What could she say? He was right. They were each other's punishment. She couldn't get rid of him until she redeemed herself with Gloria. She hated to admit it, but she was shackled to the cat. I'm here to find out what happened to Daria, she said. Gloria hadn't given him a mission, and she liked to point that out. You know, that's not completely true, he said smoothly. Gloria wanted to get rid of you before she heard about Daria. You went too far. You always go too far. She wouldn't dignify that with an answer. She knew perfectly well that she and the cat were bound together until Gloria decided they'd learned their lessons. Luckily, she was also there to help find a missing witch, and that at least made it seem like Gloria respected her. I make the decisions, she said finally. You're in charge of nothing. The cat dropped to the floor in an elegant way and circled around her, pumping his tail up. But to continue, he said, I can say with all modesty that I do deserve a car, a convertible. Deep blue, I think. Thank you.
Wow, Karen, that was phenomenal as usual. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. That was amazing. Loved every minute. So look for The Splendid City and also go back and read the notes. My goodness. Our next reader, the person who has to follow that act, would be Shameez Patel Papathanasiou. I'm sorry. We just practiced this and then I'm sure you'll do it much better yourself in a moment. Shameez was born and raised in Cape Town, South Africa. She is a civil engineer by day, fantasy author by night, and a chocolate chip cookie fiend somewhere in between. Her literary adventures take her to new worlds filled with magic, monsters, and someone to fall in love with. Shameez, over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Shameez Patel Papathanasiou. Hope you can all hear me. I'll be reading from The Last Feather, which is my debut fantasy novel, and I'll be reading from Lucas's point of view. This is chapter 3, after he's tried and failed to contact his best friend Cassia via her dreams, since they're in different realms. Lucas slammed his fist on the dark wooden table, sending a shudder through the large dining room. Cass still couldn't hear him. She seemed to have stopped trying. When she occasionally tried speaking, he couldn't hear her either. He sighed, watching her stare at him, mildly amused. If he wasn't so desperate to get hold of her, he'd have found it amusing too. Blinking a few times, she disappeared. Presumably, she'd woken up. He often found himself wondering whether it was for work or university. He hoped she'd gone on to study medicine, just as she said she would, even though he'd used every opportunity to try and convince her to take a gap year with him and backpack through Europe. That's it, Lachlan said, exhaling. I'm going to fetch her myself. Lachlan hovered behind him like a shadow, overwhelming him, not necessarily with darkness, but a lack of light. Lucas pushed his chair back and stood. He turned to face Lachlan, meeting his hard gaze. Lachlan's unnatural blue eyes flashed. Your plan isn't working. I'll fetch her. His tone was hard and unkind. Discomfort grew in Lucas's stomach. If he had it his way, he wouldn't let Lachlan near her. Even though Lachlan said he needed Cassia as much as they did, he was still a first. Back off, Lucas replied. We're doing this my way. He took a step toward Lachlan, and while Lachlan, being a first, was already taller than the average person, Lucas towered over him. Lachlan raised his hands in surrender, and a playful smirk covered his smug face. All right, Your Highness. Don't call me that, Lucas countered. A muscle in his jaw hardened, and he willed it to relax. He wouldn't let Lachlan's taunting get to him, not today. Lachlan rolled his eyes and said, I thought it would be wise to teach you some manners, since you always conveniently forget to address me properly. He grabbed the end of his maroon and gold cloak, lifting the first insignia, a full moon surrounded by 6 stars, to his chest, and vanished. Lucas marched upstairs to the library, seething. This was usual after any interaction with Lachlan. The library door swung open at his command, and the lights turned on. Shelves extended as far as he could see. He had been here for about 4 years, and there were parts of the library he still hadn't had the chance to explore. Books and scrolls lined the walls from floor to ceiling. The dark shelves absorbed light and ushered in a quietness that was unshakable. He slid his hand across the book covers, dust flickered off and disappeared into darkness. He found the Book of Visionaries exactly where he had last seen it and made his way over to the desk in the corner. He sat down and opened the heavy book from the beginning for the 3rd time. There had to be a way he could speak to her in her dreams. He must be missing something. Maybe he wasn't powerful enough. Maybe she wasn't. Or maybe their bond wasn't as strong as he thought. Whatever the problem was, he had to solve it. Too many lives depended on it. Lucas. He spun around, recognizing the deep voice. So stood behind him, casually leaning against one of the shelves, a shelf filled with smut. These are my favorites, So said, sticking his thumb out, pointing at the shelf behind him. A laugh escaped Lucas against his better judgment. You must be the one who's putting them there. All literature should be respected, So replied with a wide, toothy smile, his white teeth contrasting with his dark skin. His broad body pushed off the shelf as he made his way toward Lucas. No luck? Nothing. Same as always. I don't think she can hear me. Lucas slammed the book closed and stood up. According to this book, he said, throwing it toward the shelf where it levitated and settled in between 2 other books perfectly. It's unlikely that I'd be able to reach her since I'm not a visionary. It was a long shot anyway. We need a new plan. How about a bit of lunch before we get started, yeah? So replied, his brows furrowed as he walked over and casually slapped Lucas on the back. Lucas sighed and nodded. So always knew when to step in. If it weren't for him, Lucas wouldn't have survived on this side. He arrived here in the Selene realm in the midst of a hurricane. Little did he know he was the cause of it. If So hadn't managed to calm him down, he would have destroyed himself and everything around him. So took full advantage of this fact. They made their way around the long passage in silence. The house, or more accurately, the manor, was different from the home he grew up in. It was old and worn, but he didn't mind. There was a sense of familiarity. Every crack in the wall or scuffed linoleum flooring had a story to tell, and every story was far more interesting than the life he used to live. So sniffed and cheered. Breeze baked something, he said, increasing the speed of his walk until he broke into a full-fledged run. Lucas shook his head in amusement as his stomach growled at the scent of freshly baked bread. Since he arrived here, he was almost always hungry. They entered the kitchen as Bree was removing the steaming loaves of bread. Her hands were covered in red oven mitts she'd knitted herself, and a soft smile covered her pretty face as she set the bread down on the table. Lucas and Zoe waited eagerly, their mouths watering as they watched her slice through the bread. Watching me isn't going to make it go any quicker, boys. Lucas jumped up to slice some cheese and Zoe quickly intercepted the knife and said, "Let me do it." I know how to slice cheese, Lucas replied, slouching back into his seat. Yeah, but I'm better at it, Zoe said, tossing the knife into the air and catching it without breaking eye contact with Lucas. Nice, Lucas said. Excellent use of your skills. Bree sat down next to Lucas and asked, Hey, still no luck? If everyone could stop asking me that, it would be great, he snapped, and immediately regretted it. He looked up into Bree's big blue eyes, naturally blue, he noted, unlike the bright blue eyes of the firsts. I'm sorry, I just don't know what to do. She covered his hand with her own and gave him a sympathetic smile. You're not doing this alone. We're all here for you, remember? Yeah, you don't actually need any of them. You've got me, Zoe said, that smile fixed on his face as he prepared their sandwiches. Bree, we're going to need another bread. I baked 5 of them, but you can get it yourself, she snapped, narrowing her eyes at Zoe. He blew her a kiss in response and she rolled her eyes. Lucas stifled a laugh. This was usual for every mealtime. Maybe we could do this without her, Bree asked, turning her attention back to Lucas. Her blonde hair fell into her face and Zoe reached out to push it back, nearly losing a hand in the process. Bree was as good with a knife as he was. We don't even know if she can help us. It's all a big risk. She needs to be here. She'll be able to help. Plus Lucas hesitated, swallowing down his sandwich before continuing. I want to help her sister. Bree sat back, understanding clouding over her eyes. She crossed her arms, and before she could say anything, Zoe spoke. Is she hot? He asked, wiping a few crumbs off his chin. She's 11. Never mind then. What about Cassia? Is she hot? We're not allowed to interfere with what happens on this side, Lucas, Bree said. She bit the inside of her cheek. Her sandwich was still untouched. If the king finds out, I know, but I have to. Her sister shouldn't be in that much pain, especially when we know what it is. We know how to fix it. Why should she suffer? Why should Cass suffer with her? Lucas noticed the fear entering Bree's eyes. He felt Zoe's heavy hands drop down on his shoulders. He hadn't seen Zoe move to stand behind him. Sorry, Lucas mumbled. He knew he'd done it again. He'd tapped into the power that equally impressed and frightened them. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Shameez. It was a really interesting world and some interesting relationships to get involved in and get excited about. So you can find out more about Shameez's work on the website that was posted earlier and also on the handout. I just popped that link over in the chat. Our final reader for today is Elizabeth Davis. Elizabeth is a second-generation writer living in Dayton, Ohio. They live there with their spouse and 2 cats, neither of which have been lost to ravenous corn mazes or sleeping serpent gods. They can be found at deadfishbooks.com when they aren't busy creating beautiful nightmares and bizarre adventures.
So, this is an unpublished work, so you all get a never-before-seen story. I went with a flash fiction, so you all will have a full story in less than 8 minutes. Let's get started. Drawing down the moon. The Thessalian witches drew down the moon. Mariana could see no reason why she shouldn't. But how? The ancient writers would be no help. They were all men, scared of the secrets of women. They wrote blood on the rites of the Bacchae, rejoicing on their isolated mountain. Their guesses about drawing down the moon would be just as crimson. But Wicca was no good either. Drawing the triple goddesses out of yourself? It was true that Hecate, Selene, and Artemis all shared the moon, and Marianne wasn't about making a connection to a vaguely defined goddess. She wanted the moon. She watched the moon every night, like Iglesias, her inspiration. She peered through her telescope on clear nights, pressing one eye close, feeling like a voyeur as she surveyed craters and mountains. Counting every sliver of waning as dark crept over, of the new moon looking for an outline, like an admirer watching a rose-laden balcony, waiting to see if her outline would emerge from behind the curtains, and bliss with a smile. As she looked for the moon, she saw her everywhere. Lost seagulls wheeled around her inland city, dropping shells at her feet, perfectly round mother of pearl. Her apartment complex complained about someone releasing moon jellies into the ornamental pond. Despite her landlord's best efforts, the pond often glowed with their light. Moonflower vines took over abandoned grates on her way to work, dinner plate blossoms blooming in her wake. But sometimes she didn't see the moon at all. When the clouds rolled over the sky and rain cascaded down, or when she went to the city where narcissistic lights blotted out everything but themselves. In those times, Marianne wrote, not just of the full moon, the poet's muse, but of the waning and waxing of the new moon. Marianne wanted the moon to know that she accepted her no matter what form she took. She wrote questions for the dark side of the moon, the face never seen, of condolences often scratched out for being too trite for the moon's lost twin. Most of all, she hoped she got the moon's pronouns right. People kept saying the moon was always female. Well, what did that matter to the moon? As she watched the sky, Marianne's life was scattered with paper. Fortune cookies told her that she was beautiful. Flyers tucked into her windshield wipers that only wished her well. Lost love letters blown from trash cans that landed at her feet. But only one got her attention. A thick envelope filled with glossy photos. The letter screamed about a beach getaway, about perfect blue skies of the tropics, of the perfect blue of the water on the beach. Marianne's eyes drifted over all of it and settled on the price. Even at a discount, it was too much for her budget. She had wanted to go to the ocean. The tides belonged to the moon, after all. But where was best? Where the sun and moon fought and worked to create rankus tides? Or as this place advertised, Tahiti, where the tides were calm, principal lunar semi-diurnal, M2 and harmonic constituent, all danced together on her tongue, like words to an arcane chant. She pondered her disappointment as she bit into a mooncake, but as she wound her way through the New Year stands, she celebrated all lunar holidays after all. The sweetness was disrupted by the slippery touch of wet paper. Spitting out the bite, Marianne investigated the red stamped pastry. A red envelope poked out of her bite. With a pull, it clanged onto the table, coins spilling out. Too much for a kid's envelope that was accidentally baked into a cake. Byzantine bronze bore a crescent moon on its worn surface. A silver Greek denarius spun, flashing between its sharp moon and soul. A gold satyr's flashing the face of Mithridates, who claimed the moon as his own, and fell. Roman Augustus coins formed regimented lines on the table. Enough for when appraising and selling was done, to follow the offer on the glossy letter. And Marianne did. She watched the sky as she flew in, as blue as the pamphlet told her. The full moon hung in the bright sky, her flight companion. But as they drew closer to the runway, jutting out on reclaimed coral reef, the blue slipped away from her. A murmur raised among the passengers, and an awkward throat clearing from the pilot, saying it must be a storm and they would be landing before it hit. But there were no clouds, just the darkness as the moon grew in the sky. The ocean swelled beneath it, flowing outward as if to make room. As the plane landed, the moon swallowed the sky. As the engines died, they all rushed out to see the sky, except for Marianne. She left her luggage behind, along with the cries from the flight attendant, as she ran and dove into the water that surrounded the airport. Into the salt water where she couldn't taste her own sweat and tears as she beat against the waves that pushed her away. But she kept looking up, seeing the moon and the horizon, until it wasn't. Looking in disbelief, seeing nothing. Marianne looked back to the airport island, seeing nothing. The water rushed back to fill the void, carrying Marianne away, dragging her down. Strong white arms wrapped around her. Lips kissed the salt away while Marianne stared into the void eyes. She was held by a small woman, her skin scarred and rocky. Marianne had never read a legend with a smile like that. It shifted with each glance, imbibing the sunlight. Her voice was raspy with new use, repeating odes back to Mary Ann. Yeah. Many have called down the moon, but only one has given the moon a new face. Thanks for listening. There is a giveaway of my short fiction today in the form that will be in the chat. If you like this, consider giving out your email to get Bat Out of Hell and La Petite Rouge Sans Merci for free.
Wow. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. That was a really engaging story to hear, and it's cool that we got to hear the whole thing. We got our little secret special, exclusive access just for us, and I wonder where it will be appearing after this. So Elizabeth was our final reader today, and I want to thank everybody so much for coming out, and be sure not to miss the next amazing selection of stories.